Archaeologists have hailed a latest discovery in Peru as possibly the most exciting find of the decade. An almost perfectly well-preserved mummy estimated to be almost 800 years old has been discovered there. Our next report gets you more details.
For 7,000 years, a mummy lay sealed inside a rock shelter in the Sahara Desert. Skin, ligaments, and tissue perfectly preserved in a place where absolutely nothing is supposed to survive. Scientists knew she was there. They knew she was ancient, but they couldn't read her DNA. The brutal desert heat destroys genetic material. Every attempt to decode mummies from environments like this had failed. Every single one. Then, in a lab at the Max Planck Institute, a team of geneticists finally broke through. And when this 7,000-year-old mummy's DNA was decoded for the first time, the results didn't just surprise the researchers. They destabilized an entire field of modern science. Because her genome didn't belong to any known human population on Earth, not a single one. And the deeper the team looked, the further back her bloodline reached, into a dark chapter of human history that should have been impossible. What they found changes everything we thought we knew. The impossible place. The Takarkori rock shelter sits in southwestern Libya, in a landscape that looks like the surface of Mars. Endless dunes, sun-scorched rock. Nothing alive for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. But here's the thing nobody tells you. 7,000 years ago, this was a paradise. Geologists call it the African humid period, a climatic event between 14,500 and 5,000 years ago that turned the entire Sahara into a lush savanna. Permanent lakes, rivers full of fish, hippos in the shallows, elephants crossing grasslands, crocodiles on the riverbanks. Rock art from this era shows swimming cattle, hunters stalking giraffes, families gathered around water. This wasn't survival, this was civilization. And people didn't just pass through, they stayed. 15 individuals were buried inside the Takarkori shelter, mostly women and children, laid to rest across thousands of years of continuous occupation. The site showed evidence of pastoralism, pottery, and organized community, stretching back over 8,000 years. These people built their lives here, generation after generation after generation. They raised animals. They traded goods across vast distances. They buried their dead in the same rock shelter their grandparents and great-grandparents had been buried in. This wasn't a campsite. This was a home. And the desert preserved what should have been lost forever. 2 of those women never decomposed. The desert air mummified them naturally, preserving their bodies in a way that almost never happens in hot environments. We scratched the sand and found the mandible, Lernia recalled, his voice still carrying the weight of that moment years later. His hands had been shaking. He knew instantly this wasn't a recent burial. We started with these 2 because they are very well preserved, Lernia said. The skin, the ligaments, the tissues. And get this, what was locked inside those tissues was about to detonate a bomb under everything we thought we knew about human history. But first, someone had to do the impossible. The miracle in the lab. Here's what you need to understand. Ancient DNA and desert heat are mortal enemies. The Sahara's temperature swings, blistering days, freezing nights, shatter genetic material at the molecular level. They snap the strands into fragments too small to read, too small to sequence, too small to mean anything. Heat doesn't just damage DNA, it annihilates it, breaks it into molecular confetti. Every previous attempt to pull usable DNA from North African remains in similar conditions had failed. Every single one. Decades of tries across Libya, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, teams from some of the best labs in the world. All of them came back empty. The scientific consensus was clear. You cannot get whole genomes from hot desert mummies. It's not difficult. It's not unlikely. It's impossible. Now, pay attention to this. Archaeogeneticist Nayata Salm at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary. Anthropology went after it anyway. Her team extracted material from the mummy's teeth and leg bones, the densest structures in the human body, where DNA hides deepest, protected inside a fortress of mineralized tissue, teeth and petrous bones, the last refuge of ancient genetic information. They used the most advanced sequencing technology available, They worked fragment by fragment, strand by strand, rebuilding a genetic code that the desert had spent 7,000 years trying to destroy. And they got it. Both genomes, complete. Johannes Krause, senior author of the study and director at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, sat in front of the results and didn't speak for a long time. The data was on the screen, the genomes were real, and they didn't make sense. These samples come from some of the oldest mummies in the world, he said finally. That we could sequence their entire genomes is a small miracle. But here's the deal. The miracle wasn't extracting the DNA. A miracle was surviving what it said. Because what came back from that sequencing changed everything. And if you're not subscribed to Vault of Discovery, now's the time. Because this is where the story breaks wide open. We're bringing you the real science that rewrites the textbooks, and what their DNA revealed next is going to change everything you thought you knew. Hit subscribe. You're going to need it. The first impossible result. The team compared the Takakori genomes against a massive dataset, 795 present-day genomes and 117 ancient genomes from across Africa, Southwestern Asia, and Europe. They were mapping these two women onto the human family tree. The expectation was simple, obvious even. During the African humid period, the Sahara was fully traversable, a continuous green corridor connecting North Africa with sub-Saharan Africa. No barriers, no deserts, no mountain ranges, nothing to stop populations from mixing freely across thousands of kilometers of fertile landscape. Hippos in the rivers, elephants on the plains, human settlements scattered across a green world with no walls. So these women should carry genetic signatures consistent with sub-Saharan African populations. That was the safe bet, the logical bet, the bet every geneticist in the world would have made without hesitation. Here's the catch. The Takakori women carried no sub-Saharan African ancestry. None. Zero. Not a fragment, not a trace, not a whisper. During the greenest, most connected era in the Sahara's entire history, when humans could walk from the Mediterranean coast to the Congo Basin through unbroken grassland, these women's ancestors had remained completely isolated from the populations living just to the south. For tens of thousands of years, in a landscape with no barriers, they maintained total genetic separation in a world that should have made separation impossible. The Green Sahara should have been a highway for genetic mixing. For this population, it all was a wall. Krause pulled the data 3 times. Same result. He called in Nataselm, same result. The numbers didn't waver. The isolation was total, and it was ancient. Far more ancient than anyone was prepared to accept. But that wasn't even the disturbing part. Because when the team pushed deeper into the genetic code, looking for any known population that matched these women, the picture didn't just get strange, it got terrifying. A 15,000-year-old connection that shouldn't exist. To find the Takakori women's closest genetic relatives, researchers compared their DNA against every ancient population in the record. Every sequenced genome from every archaeological site across Africa, Europe, and the Near East. They expected a regional match, North African, maybe Mediterranean, and get this, they didn't match any nearby group, not one. Their closest relatives were 15,000-year-old hunter-gatherers buried in Tafaralt Cave in Morocco, a population that predates the African. Humid period entirely. That had no geographic overlap with the Takakori region. That existed in a completely different era, a completely different environment, thousands of years before the Green Sahara was even born. And yet, these two populations, separated by 8,000 years and hundreds of kilometers of terrain, shared a deep genetic signature found nowhere else on Earth. Not in Europe, not in the Near East, not in sub-Saharan Africa, not in Central Asia, not anywhere. A genetic bond that defied geography, defied time, and defied every model scientists had built to explain how ancient populations relate to one another. Both the Takakori mummies and the Tafaralt hunter-gatherers traced their ancestry to a North African lineage completely unrelated to sub-Saharan populations. A lineage that had apparently stretched along the northern edge of the continent for tens of thousands of years. Invisible to every study, silent in every dataset, an entire branch of the human family tree that science had walked past for decades without ever knowing it was there. Here's the catch. That was just the surface. Because the team didn't stop at 15,000 years, they kept pushing further back, deeper into the data. And what they found at the bottom made the room go cold. The 50,000-year ghost. Now the team went deeper, past 15,000 years, past the limits of anything they expected to find. The researchers compared the Takakori genomes against one of the oldest known populations of modern humans ever identified outside Africa, 50,000-year-old individuals from Zlati Horse in the Czech Republic. These weren't just ancient humans. These were the very first wave of Homo sapiens to leave the African continent, the originals, the dawn of human expansion across the planet. The comparison came back, and the lab went silent. People stopped typing. Conversations died mid-sentence. The Takakori women were more closely related to these 50,000-year-old Czech individuals than to any sub-Saharan African population alive today. Stop. Read that again. These Libyan shepherdesses, buried in a rock shelter 7,000 years ago, carried DNA that linked them directly to the first humans who ever walked out of Africa, 50,000 years ago. Not a distant connection, not a faint echo. A direct genetic line stretching back to the very beginning of the human journey out of the motherland. Their ancestors were part of that original migration, or closely connected to it. And then somehow they came back, or they were left behind. Either way, they stayed. And they stayed genetically unchanged for 50,000 years. Now pay attention to this, because the scale of that number is almost impossible to comprehend. All of recorded human history, every empire, every war, every plague, every revolution, every invention from the wheel to the internet, fits inside the last 5,000 years. That's 1/10 of how long this population remained genetically isolated. 10 times the entire span of civilization. 10 times everything we've ever written down. While the rest of humanity spent those 50 millennia spreading across every continent, developing thousands of languages, building Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, mixing and merging and evolving in every direction, this population sat in North Africa, frozen, unmixed, untouched. Ice ages came and went. Sea levels rose 100 meters and fell again. Entire species appeared, thrived, and vanished. The woolly mammoth walked the earth and went extinct. Humans invented agriculture, writing, bronze, iron, cities, and empires. And this lineage just persisted, in the same corner of the world, unchanged. Scientists had actually suspected something like this existed. For years, faint statistical anomalies in the DNA of modern North Africans had haunted population geneticists. Traces of an unknown ancestral group that didn't correspond to any documented population, living or dead. The signatures were too subtle to prove anything, too faint to build a theory around, but too consistent to ignore. They kept showing up, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Libya. Always the same whisper in the data, always unexplained, so researchers gave it a name before they ever found a body. They called it a ghost population, a human group whose existence had only ever been inferred from echoes in living people's DNA, suspected, theorized, argued about in conference rooms and academic journals, never proven, no bones, no burials, no physical evidence of any kind, until the sand of Takakori gave up its dead, and the ghost got a face. Nada Selm stared at the data for hours before releasing the statement. She'd checked it, rechecked it, had colleagues verify independently. The numbers held. Our research challenges previous assumptions about North African populations' history and highlights the existence of a deeply rooted and long isolated genetic lineage, she said. But here's the deal. The ghost population wasn't done talking, because its next secret didn't just rewrite history. It demolished the most fundamental theory about how civilization itself spreads across the earth. Civilization without migration. The Takakori women were pastoralists. They herded sheep, goats, and cattle. They made pottery. They built a functioning agricultural community inside the Green Sahara when farming and animal domestication were the cutting-edge technologies transforming human civilization. And here's why that's a problem. For decades, scientists believed pastoralism spread from the Near East, where sheep and goats were first domesticated around 10,000 years ago, through physical migration. Farmers and herders moved outward from the Fertile Crescent, carrying their animals into new territories, absorbing or replacing the people they encountered. That was the model. Migration equals civilization. People carry ideas in their genes. The Decoded DNA blew that model apart. Their genomes contain no Near Eastern ancestry, no Levantine signatures, no Anatolian farmer DNA, no European agricultural lineages, not a single genetic marker from any population that the conventional model required to explain how herding reached the Sahara. Zero. Yet they were herding, clearly, definitively, for thousands of years, with animals that originated on the other side of the Mediterranean. How? And get this, they had pottery from sub-Saharan Africa. They had pottery from the Nile Valley. They had cultural connections stretching across thousands of kilometers. They were plugged into a continental network of ideas, technologies, and trade goods. They just weren't plugged into anyone else's gene pool. We know now that they were isolated in terms of genetics, but not in cultural terms, Dialernia explained, leaning forward like he was sharing something he still couldn't quite believe. There are a lot of networks that we know from several parts of the continent, because we have pottery coming from sub-Saharan Africa. We have pottery coming from the Nile Valley and the like. The Takakori people traded, they interacted, they absorbed ideas and technologies from every civilization that passed through the Green Sahara. But they did not interbreed with them, not once, not over thousands of years. Knowledge flowed freely across the landscape. Genes did not. Ideas crossed every boundary. DNA crossed none. Think about that for a second. These people were sitting at the crossroads of the ancient world. Traders from the south, traders from the east, herders from every direction passing through their territory. And for thousands of years, they took the knowledge and rejected the bloodlines. Their tools, pottery, and even herding methods were adopted from outsiders, Krauss explained. But there was little intermarriage. He paused before adding the line that would define the study. They're like living fossils, clinging to their ancestral roots until the Sahara dried up. Ideas can cross boundaries that genes never do. Civilization can travel without people. And the entire model of how the ancient world worked, migration, replacement, interbreeding as the engine of progress, has to be reconsidered in light of what two women's DNA proves is possible. This discovery, Krauss later admitted, suggests we've been telling the wrong story about how humanity built its earliest societies. But that's not even the crazy part, because buried in the deepest layer of their genome was one more secret. And this one reached back to a time before our species was alone on this planet. The Neanderthal timestamp. And then came the detail that reached back further than anyone expected, past the dawn of civilization, past the Green Sahara, past even the emergence of modern human culture, to a time when our species was not alone on this planet. The mummies carried Neanderthal DNA, about 0.15% of their total genome. Most Europeans and Asians carry between 1.5 and 2%. Most sub-Saharan Africans carry almost none. The Takakori women sat in a strange, narrow space between more than African, far less than Eurasian. Here's the catch. That tiny fraction is a molecular timestamp. It dates to one specific event. The ancestors of these women encountered Neanderthals, or people who had recently bred with them, during that first great wave of human migration out of Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago. They picked up a faint trace of Neanderthal genetics during that initial contact. The very first handshake between our species and our closest evolutionary cousins. Then they carried it in their cells for 50,000 years, never accumulating more, never mixing again. A genetic snapshot from that original encounter, frozen in these women's DNA like an insect in amber, while every other population that left Africa went on to accumulate more Neanderthal DNA through repeated contact. This lineage sealed itself off. One encounter, one trace, 50,000 years of silence. It's like a cultural island, said Krauss, shaking his head. They absorbed ideas but kept their bloodline pure. Harold Ringbauer, group leader of archaeogenetics at the Max Planck Institute, pulled up the comparative data and sat back in his chair. In Europe, populations mixed and merged every few thousand years. No lineage lasted, nothing stayed pure. But in North Africa, one group had endured for 50 millennia, genetically untouched, carrying the fingerprint of humanity's oldest interspecies encounter. No parallel, no precedent, nothing like it anywhere in the archaeological record. And then the desert took them. Erased by sand. The Takakori population didn't die in a war. They weren't conquered. They weren't invaded. They weren't wiped out by disease or famine in the usual sense. They were erased by climate, by the earth itself, slowly. Over centuries, grain by grain, aridification turned the green Sahara into the desert we know today. It wasn't sudden, it was patient, merciless. The rains came less often, then less, then barely at all. The lakes shrank year by year, first losing their edges, then their centers, then vanishing into cracked white earth. Grasslands turned brown, then bare, then sand swallowed them. Rivers that had flowed for thousands of years dried to nothing. The world these women had known, the world their ancestors had known for 50,000 years, was disappearing around them in slow motion, and there was nowhere left to go. And the ecosystem that had sustained this ghost population for 50 millennia finally gave out. The genetic boundaries that had defined the Takakori people, boundaries they had maintained through thousands of years of trade and contact, through watering holes and grazing grounds and pottery exchanges, became impossible to hold. As the habitable zones contracted and resources vanished, the isolation that had preserved their identity for 50,000 years finally broke. They were absorbed into the broader North African populations they had traded with but never merged with, leaving behind faint genetic traces in modern North Africans and 2 naturally mummified women in a Libyan rock shelter, waiting 7,000 years for someone to listen. The whole genome carries the DNA for many of your ancestors, said Ringbauer quietly. As you go along the genome, you start seeing the different trees of your ancestors. One genome carries the stories of many. Louise Humphrey, a research leader at the Natural History Museum's Center for Human Evolutionist Research in London, who was not involved in the study, confirmed the significance. She stated that the DNA reveals most of the women's ancestry traces to a previously unknown ancient North African genetic lineage, and that future research is likely to yield further insights into human migrations in this region. These 2 women, 2 shepherdesses who died in a green savanna 7,000 years ago, proved that a branch of humanity survived for 50,000 years in total genetic isolation while borrowing knowledge from every civilization around them. They proved civilization spreads without migration. They proved human populations can stay genetically frozen across timescales that make all of recorded history look like a single afternoon. And they proved that what we know about human ancestry is only what the sand has chosen to give back so far. The Sahara isn't empty. It's a tomb, 9.5 million square kilometers, an area the size of the United States, thousands of unexplored rock shelters from an era when this was the most fertile landscape on Earth. As sequencing technology grows more powerful and archaeology pushes deeper into Libya, Algeria, Chad, and Niger, the ghost population of Takakori may be only the first lost lineage to surface, only the first body the sand decided to release. The next mummy is out there right now, buried, preserved, carrying a genome no one alive has ever seen, waiting in the dark for someone to scratch the surface. And based on what Takakori revealed, whatever comes next could make this discovery look like a prologue. And when it's found, everything changes again. If this rewired the way you see human history, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. What do you think is still buried under the Sahara? And if you're not subscribed to Vault of Discovery yet, fix that right now, because what that desert is hiding, we're gonna find. And you're gonna want to be here when we do.